He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just stood there while the most powerful woman in the building told a room full of people that he had destroyed everything they'd worked for. And he let her. That silence cost Mason Reed everything. His badge access, his reputation, the respect of every colleague who'd nodded at him in the hallway for 3 years. All of it, gone in the span of 4 minutes inside a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of Apex Dynamics. What no one in that room knew, what she didn't know, was why he stayed quiet. And that reason was sitting at home right now, eating cereal for dinner, waiting for her dad to walk through the door. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while. The morning started the way most Mondays started for Mason Reed, badly, and without enough coffee. His alarm went off at 6:15, same as always, but he'd been awake since 5:30, lying in the dark staring at the water stain on the ceiling above his bed. It was shaped vaguely like a duck. He'd noticed it 2 winters ago when a pipe sweated during a cold snap, and he kept meaning to repaint over it, but somehow there was always something more pressing. Chloe's school supplies. The car registration. The cracked sole on his left work shoe that he'd fixed twice with superglue and was now just accepting as a permanent feature of his life. At 6:17, Chloe padded into his room wearing one pink sock and one yellow one, her dark hair in a tangle that suggested she'd fought her pillow all night and lost decisively. "Daddy, we're out of the good cereal. There's oatmeal." She stared at him with the specific brand of 7-year-old disappointment that communicated, wordlessly and completely, that oatmeal was not a solution. "I'll stop at the store tonight," he said. "You said that Thursday." "I meant it Thursday too. Get dressed. Wear the blue sweater. It's cold today." She turned and shuffled back down the hallway, already negotiating with herself about the sweater. Mason sat up, ran a hand over his face, and looked at the framed photo on the nightstand. The one that had lived there for 4 years without being moved, because moving it felt like a step he wasn't ready to take. His late wife, Laura, caught mid-laugh at a barbecue. She'd had serial strong opinions, too. She would have sided with Chloe about the oatmeal. He got up. Done. The drive to Westfield Elementary took 11 minutes on a normal morning. This was not a normal morning. A water main had burst 2 blocks from the school, and traffic was backed up past the pharmacy, past the dry cleaner, all the way to the intersection where the light always ran long. Mason sat in the line with the heat on low and Chloe in the back seat singing something under her breath. A song she'd invented herself, with no discernible melody and lyrics that seemed to consist entirely of the names of her classmates. "Chloe," she stopped. "Yeah? Did you eat anything before we left?" Silence. "Chloe, I had half a granola bar." "From where?" "The bottom of my backpack." He closed his eyes for a moment. The car behind him honked because the line had moved 4 feet. He inched forward. "I'll buy you a muffin at the school office," he said. "They only have blueberry." "Blueberry's fine." "I don't like the ones from school. The blueberries are like little rocks." He couldn't argue with that. He'd had one once when he'd stayed for a parent-teacher conference and eaten out of nervousness, and she wasn't wrong. "Okay, I'll put money in your lunch account, and you can get the hot breakfast." "Okay." A beat. "Daddy?" "Yeah." "Is today going to be a good day for you?" He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window at the stopped cars, her chin resting on her hand, asking the question the way she sometimes did. Not with worry, exactly, but with a kind of careful attention that was, honestly, more emotional intelligence than most adults he worked with could manage. "Probably a normal day," he said. "Why?" "You look tired." "I'm always tired, baby." "More tired than regular tired." He didn't have an answer for that. The light changed. He drove. What? Apex Dynamics occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower in the financial district, which was the kind of address that was supposed to communicate that you'd arrived somewhere. Mason had worked there for 3 years, though his history with the company was considerably longer than that, a fact known to almost no one currently employed there, including, apparently, the legal and HR departments. He took the elevator to the 9th floor, which housed the infrastructure and systems engineering team, and was almost to his desk when Daniel Cho intercepted him near the printer bank. Daniel was Mason's closest approximation of a work friend, a Korean-American engineer 2 years his junior who wore the same rotation of flannel shirts and had a wife and twin toddlers and a sleep deprivation problem that made Mason's look modest by comparison. They didn't socialize outside the office. They got coffee sometimes. It was enough. "Hey," Daniel said in a voice that immediately told Mason something was wrong. "Hey." Mason set his bag down. "What?" Daniel glanced over his shoulder. The floor wasn't fully populated yet. It was only 8:40, but the few people who were in had that quality of stillness that meant they were listening more than they were working. "There was an incident over the weekend," Daniel said, quieter now. "A breach. They're saying someone accessed the Helios architecture files and the client data partition." Mason felt something go cool in his chest. "When?" "Saturday night, between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., from what I heard." "How bad?" "Bad, like board-level bad. Keller's already up there." He tilted his head toward the ceiling, indicating the executive floors. "Legal came in at 7 this morning." Mason exhaled slowly through his nose. "Do they know what was taken?" "The Helios specs mostly, and some client contract data." Daniel hesitated, and there it was. The slight shift in his eyes, the way he was looking at Mason just a degree too carefully. "Mason, they're saying the access logs show it was your credentials." The floor seemed to tilt slightly. "That's not possible," Mason said. "I know. I was home Saturday night. I was with Chloe." "I know," Daniel said again, and the repetition of it, the gentleness of it, the way he said, "I know," instead of "I believe you," told Mason that whatever was coming had already been decided somewhere above them, and Daniel was trying to prepare him for the landing. "They're calling a full department meeting at 10, Daniel said. "All of infrastructure. I think—" He stopped. "I think you should be ready for it to go sideways." Natalie Sterling arrived at Apex Dynamics at 7:45 that morning, which was late for her. She was usually in by 7, sometimes 6:30, depending on what was pending. She'd had 4 hours of sleep because she'd spent most of Sunday night on calls with the security contractors who managed the company's breach response protocol, and the picture they'd painted was, in the language of her chief of security, concerning. She was 30 years old and had been CEO for 14 months. The board had been uncertain about the appointment when her predecessor stepped down. She was young, they said, which was their way of saying she was young and a woman, which was their way of saying they were nervous about things they wouldn't say out loud. She'd learned to move through that kind of skepticism by being thorough, direct, and prepared for every meeting with 2 more layers of information than anyone expected. This morning, she was not prepared enough. Her assistant, a capable 26-year-old named Priya, met her at the elevator with a tablet and a summary. "Security's full report is in your inbox," Priya said, matching her stride. "The breach accessed Helios development files, folders R7 through R14, and the client contract annex from the Fairview deal. The access point was a registered employee account. The logs are clean. No spoofing flags, no VPN anomalies." "Name?" Priya handed her the tablet. The name on the screen was Mason Reed. Natalie looked at it for a moment. She knew the name. Infrastructure, systems engineer, 3-year employee, quiet, unremarkable performance reviews, no disciplinary history. She'd probably passed him in the hallway without registering him. "Have legal pull his full file," she said. "And I want the access logs on my desk before 10. She reviewed the logs in her office with 2 members of the security team and Apex's general counsel, a methodical man named Gerald Finch, who had the verbal pace of someone who charged by the syllable. The logs were, on their surface, straightforward. Mason Reed's credentials had been used to access the Helios files at 11:17 p.m. on Saturday night. The session had lasted 94 minutes. Files had been downloaded to an external endpoint, which had since gone dark. A burner device, almost certainly. The session had ended, the account had gone idle, and no one had flagged it until the automated anomaly detection ran its Sunday morning sweep. He accessed R folders from his own account, Finch said. No attempt to mask the credential trail. Either he was careless or he wanted it to look like carelessness. Or someone else used his credentials, Natalie said. Finch looked at her the way people sometimes did when she offered complications they hadn't invited. The biometric authorization for remote access cleared on his registered device. His phone? Registered personal device, yes. She looked at the logs again. There was something about the access pattern that nagged at her. Something she couldn't quite articulate yet. The timestamps were clean. The session path was logical. But something about the specific files accessed felt off to her, and she couldn't say why. She didn't have time to pursue it before the 10 o'clock meeting. Dick. The conference room on the 14th floor seated 30, and it was full. Every senior member of the infrastructure and systems team was present. Several people from legal. The head of IT security, a compact man named Howard Briggs, who had the permanent expression of someone anticipating a disaster he'd already predicted. And at the front of the room, standing at the head of the long glass table, Natalie Sterling. Mason had taken a seat near the middle, not at the back, which would have looked like hiding, not at the front, which would have looked like defiance. Middle, visible and unremarkable. He'd been in this room before for quarterly reviews and budget presentations, and it had never felt like this. The particular atmosphere of a room in which everyone already knew something that hadn't been said yet. He looked around. A few people met his eyes and looked away. A few didn't look at him at all. Natalie opened the meeting without preamble. She was standing, not sitting, which meant this was not going to be a collaborative discussion. As most of you are aware by now, Apex Dynamics experienced a serious data breach on Saturday night. Files from the Helios project architecture and the Fairview client contract annex were accessed and downloaded from an external endpoint. This is a material security event. Legal is engaged, and we will be cooperating with authorities if that becomes necessary. Silence. I want to be straightforward with all of you, because I think you deserve that. She paused. The access logs from Saturday's breach trace to a single registered employee account and device. The investigation is ongoing, and we are pursuing every angle. She looked directly at Mason. But the evidence as it stands points to one person in this room. She didn't say his name immediately. She held the pause for 1 beat, 2 beats, and in that gap, Mason felt the entire room turn toward him. Not physically, but in that specific way where attention moves like heat. Mason Reed. He didn't flinch. He didn't look down. He looked back at her, steady and level, and he said nothing. Natalie pressed forward. The access was made through your account from your registered device at 11:17 p.m. on Saturday night. 94 minutes of active session time. Files downloaded to an external drive that's since been wiped. She paused. Would you like to explain that to this room? What Mason thought in that moment was this. I was home. I was with Chloe. She had a nightmare around midnight, and I was in her room for an hour rubbing her back until she fell asleep again. My phone was on the charger in the kitchen. I haven't touched the Helios files since the last architecture review in February. What he said was, no. Natalie's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly, but something recalibrating. No? No, he said again, the same flat weight in the word. I don't want to explain anything to this room. Mr. Reed, I understand what the logs say, he said quietly. I understand what you think happened. I'm not going to stand here and argue about it in front of 40 people. He looked at her calmly. If you want to talk to me, you know where to find me. Then he put his hands flat on the table, pushed his chair back, and stood up. Is there anything else? The room was absolutely still. Natalie looked at him for a moment, and something crossed her face that she didn't intend to show, something that wasn't quite certainty, something that looked more like the first faint edge of a question. And then she said, Your access credentials have been suspended pending investigation. IT will escort you out to collect your personal items. All right, Mason said. He walked to the door. He opened it. He walked out. Behind him, the room erupted. Woot. Howard Briggs caught up with him at the elevator, accompanied by a young IT technician who had the miserable posture of someone doing a task they'd been assigned against their better instincts. I'm sorry about this, Howard said, and he actually sounded like he meant it. Howard Briggs was a decent man who had worked in corporate security long enough to be skeptical of clean evidence trails. But his opinion wasn't the one that mattered today. "It's fine," Mason said. "I want you to know the investigation isn't closed." "I know. If there's anything you can tell us—" "Not right now," Mason said. The elevator arrived. He stepped in. Howard held the door for a moment. "For what it's worth," Howard said, lowering his voice, "the access pattern bothered me too. The file selection doesn't match your role scope." Mason looked at him. "Then keep looking," he said. Howard let the door close. He was back on the sidewalk by 11:15, carrying a cardboard box that held a coffee mug, a charging cable, a small framed drawing Chloe had made of the two of them. "That's us at the park. See, your head is the big circle." And 3 years of small desk accumulation. It was cold. He'd forgotten his coat inside. He'd had to leave it on the hook by the elevator because the IT technician had been hovering and he'd walked out before remembering it. And the wind off the street had a bite to it that made his eyes water, which was fine because it gave them something to do. He stood there for a moment on the sidewalk in front of the tower, looking up at the glass face of the building. 14 floors up, in a conference room, 40 of his colleagues were probably still dissecting what had just happened. The story was already writing itself. The quiet guy, the loner, the one nobody really knew. It's always the ones you don't expect. Somebody's already got a theory. By lunch, it would be a fact. By the end of the day, it would be a thing that everyone had always suspected. He knew how these things worked. He picked up his box and walked to his car. He had 4 hours before he needed to pick up Chloe. He drove home, put the cardboard box on the kitchen table, and made himself a cup of coffee he didn't really want. He stood at the window and drank half of it and thought, carefully and without panic, about what had actually happened on Saturday night. He had been home, that was certain. He and Chloe had watched a movie after dinner. She'd picked an animated one about a girl who could talk to animals, and he'd fallen half asleep on the couch during the second act, and she'd woken him up by bouncing on his legs, laughing. They'd had popcorn. He'd made her brush her teeth twice because she'd inhaled half the bowl. He'd put her to bed around 9:30. She'd woken him up around midnight, crying from a dream about something she couldn't explain. A big dark feeling, she'd said. And he'd gone to her room and stayed there until she fell back asleep. His phone had been charging in the kitchen all night. He hadn't touched the Helios files. He hadn't been anywhere near a computer. Someone had used his credentials. That was the only explanation that made sense, which meant someone had his login information and had either cloned his registered device or found another way to bypass the biometric authorization, which meant this was not a sloppy crime of opportunity. This was deliberate, planned, specific. The question was, why him? He thought about it. Thought about who knew his login patterns, who had access to his desk, who might have had reason to want a scapegoat. He couldn't land on a name. Not yet. He poured the rest of the coffee out and rinsed the cup and went to the small second bedroom he used as an office. In the closet, behind a winter coat he never wore, and a box of Chloe's outgrown clothes he kept meaning to donate, was a flat wooden box roughly the size of a shoebox but older looking. Dark wood, worn edges, the kind of thing that looked like it had been handed down even though it hadn't been. He'd made it himself, years ago, in a period of his life that felt so distant it might as well have belonged to a different person. He didn't open it. Not today. He put his hand on the lid for a moment, then let it go. Get. He picked Chloe up at 3:20. She got into the car and immediately told him that Maddie Nguyen had a new backpack with a holographic front pocket, and it was the best backpack she'd ever seen. "Good for Maddie," he said. "It changes colors when you move." "That's pretty cool. Can I get one?" "Maybe for your birthday." "That's in April." "I know when your birthday is, Chloe." She settled back in her seat and looked out the window. "How was your day?" He thought about how to answer that. He'd had the worst professional morning of his adult life, been publicly accused of corporate espionage by the CEO of a company he'd helped build from a napkin drawing in a kitchen table, and been escorted out of a building by an IT technician who looked like he wanted to apologize but didn't know how. "Medium," he said. She nodded sagely. "Mine was medium too. We had a substitute who didn't know how anything worked." "That sounds frustrating." She thought the reading corner was for quiet time. She shook her head. It's not for quiet time, it's for reading. There's a difference? Daddy. The word carried a weight that suggested this was obvious. He almost smiled. Almost. That night, after dinner, pasta, which he made from scratch because it was cheap, and Chloe ate it without negotiation. And after homework, and after the bath, she took too long in because she was narrating a story she was telling to her rubber duck. And after the 2 books they read together before bed, Mason sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the apartment and opened his laptop. He had 47 emails. He read none of them. He pulled up the company's public-facing system architecture page, what they'd allow him to see from outside the network, which wasn't much, and stared at the diagrams there. The Helios framework, the integration architecture, the layered data partitioning system that kept client records separate from core system files. He designed most of that, not under his current role, not recently, but the bones of it, the underlying logic, the way the partitions talk to each other, the specific redundancy approach that made the Helios system both fast and difficult to breach from outside. That was from earlier, from before. From a time when he and a woman named Laura Reyes, who later became Laura Reed, had been working in a rented office space above a Thai restaurant with 4 other people and a whiteboard that had been written on so many times it was permanently gray. The company that became Apex Dynamics had been built on that whiteboard. He stared at the screen for a while. Then he closed the laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and went to check on Chloe. She was asleep on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, the stuffed rabbit she'd named Gerald sitting watch on the pillow beside her. The nightlight made the room orange and warm. Her breathing was steady. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he went to bed. By Tuesday morning, the story had fully circulated. He knew because Daniel texted him, "How are you doing? People here are talking." He didn't respond immediately. He made breakfast, got Chloe to school, came home, and then texted back, "I'm fine. What are they saying?" Daniel's reply came quickly. "Mostly that you did it. A few people aren't sure. Briggs hasn't said anything, but he's been in the security office all morning with the door closed." Then, a minute later, FYI, Natalie Sterling is reviewing the logs herself. Mason stared at that last message for a long time. Natalie Sterling is reviewing the logs herself. He didn't know what to make of that. She'd accused him publicly in front of 40 people with a certainty that had flattened all the air in the room. She hadn't asked him questions. She hadn't allowed for the possibility that the logs were wrong. She'd looked at him like he was a problem that had been identified and was now in the process of being resolved. And now she was reviewing the logs herself. He thought about the nagging feeling she'd had, the thing he'd thought he'd seen in her expression in the conference room just before the door closed behind him, the thing that looked like a question. Maybe she wasn't as certain as she'd seemed. Maybe she was starting to feel the same way he felt, standing at the window with his coffee the day before, turning the access pattern over in his mind and finding the edges rough and wrong. He put his phone down and went to shower. He had nowhere to be today. He had nowhere to be tomorrow. He had a daughter to take care of and a name that was currently being discussed in a lot of conversations he wasn't in, and he had a worn wooden box sitting in a closet that contained, among other things, the kind of information that could remake everything. He wasn't ready to open it yet, but he was getting there. On Wednesday, he went back. Not inside. His badge was suspended, and he had no intention of making a scene at the front desk. But he walked to the coffee shop across the street from the Apex building, the one with the windows that faced the lobby, and he sat there with a black coffee and his laptop and worked on the freelance infrastructure consulting he'd quietly maintained for 2 years as a financial hedge against exactly this kind of situation. He worked for 3 hours. At one point, he looked up and saw through the glass Natalie Sterling coming through the revolving doors of the building. She was moving quickly, the way she always moved, but she wasn't looking at her phone. She was looking straight ahead, and there was something in her posture that read as distracted. The specific distraction of someone who's turning a problem over and over and hasn't found a solution yet. She walked past the coffee shop without looking in. He watched her go, then looked back at his screen. The office, for Mason, had never been the center of anything. He'd always treated it as functional space, A place where work happened, separated from the life that happened elsewhere. Some people needed the office to feel real. Mason needed his apartment and Chloe's school schedule and the Tuesday nights when they played cards at the kitchen table and she consistently cheated in ways she thought were invisible but were entirely visible, and the Saturday mornings when they made pancakes badly and ate them anyway. That was what was real. But the accusation had followed him out of the building and into those spaces. He could feel it at the school pickup, wondering if other parents had heard, if it had reached into that world too. He felt it in the middle of the night when he woke at 3 a.m. with his heart already going and his brain already running through the access logs, through the timestamp, through who could have done this and why and how. He felt it when Chloe asked on Wednesday evening why he'd been home so much lately. "Are you on vacation?" she asked. She was coloring at the kitchen table, her tongue slightly out as she worked on something elaborate. "Sort of," he said. "Vacation is supposed to be fun." "This one's more like a long weekend." She looked up at him. She had Laura's eyes, the same shade of brown, the same habit of going very still when she was reading someone. "Did something happen at work?" "A little bit, yeah." "Did you get in trouble?" He considered lying. He was good at it when he needed to be. Not habitual lying, but the specific parental skill of reshaping truth into something age-appropriate without it being false. "I had a misunderstanding with some people," he said. "We're working it out." She looked at him for another second, then looked back at her coloring. "Okay," she said, accepting this in the way she sometimes accepted things she didn't fully believe but chose not to press. He watched her for a moment. The crown of her head, the way she held her crayon, the absolute certainty with which she was coloring a sky 3 different shades of blue. "We're working it out." He'd said it like it was already in motion, like he had a plan. He thought maybe, finally, he did. He got a call Thursday morning from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer it, but something made him pick up. "Is this Mason Reed?" A woman's voice. Professional, careful, no warmth in it yet. "It is." A pause. "This is Natalie Sterling." He was quiet. "I'd like to talk to you," she said. "In person. Not in the building. Somewhere neutral. There's a coffee shop on Mercer." "I know it," he said. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. He thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. He thought about the conference room, about 40 people, about the way she'd said his name and the room had already convicted him before the word was done. "All right," he said. He hung up before she could add anything. Across the kitchen, the closet door was closed, the wooden box behind it patient and still. Not yet, he thought, but soon. What? Friday morning was cold and gray, the kind of October weather that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain. Mason got Chloe to school early because Mrs. Pellegrino had a 7:45 reading group, and Chloe had missed the last one, and then he drove to the coffee shop on Mercer and arrived at 7:55. Natalie was already there. She was sitting at a corner table with a coffee she hadn't touched, and a coat that cost more than his monthly rent, with her hands folded on the table and an expression that he couldn't read from the door. He ordered a black coffee, carried it over, and sat down across from her without preamble. They looked at each other. She looked different outside the building, not smaller, that wasn't the right word, but more present. Less like a position and more like a person. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there Tuesday, and the careful, polished professional composure she wore in the office was still there, but thinner, like a layer of paint over something rougher. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You said neutral ground," he said. "I appreciated that." A breath. "I've been reviewing the breach investigation independently," she said. "I've been in the logs myself, not just reading the security team's report, and I found some things I want to ask you about." "All right." The files accessed, the specific subdirectories within the Helios architecture partition. She pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket and set it on the table. It was printed with a log summary, and she'd circled several lines. R7 through R14. Those are the original framework files from the company's early development period. Pre-commercial, pre-Series A. They haven't been touched in active development in over 5 years. As Mason looked at the circled lines, "What would a current infrastructure systems engineer want with those files?" she asked. "Your role doesn't touch legacy architecture. You've never been assigned to any project that required access to R7 through R14. No, he said. I haven't. So either you accessed files completely outside your professional scope for reasons that don't align with any project you're on, or someone chose those files specifically, he said quietly, and they chose my credentials because they thought no one would look too hard. She was very still across from him. Why would someone choose those files? He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. It was warm and he was cold and he was very, very tired. Because those files contain things that certain people would rather stay buried, he said, and whoever went looking for them knew where to look. She studied him. How would you know that? He met her eyes. Because I wrote them, he said simply. Every one of them. 7 years ago, in an office that doesn't exist anymore, with my wife, who doesn't exist anymore either. He paused. I know what's in R7 through R14 better than anyone in that building, including whoever stole them. The coffee shop hummed around them. Outside, the sky had made up its mind and started to rain. Natalie looked at him for a long moment. I think, she said carefully, that you and I need to talk more than we're going to be able to do in this coffee shop. He nodded. There are things I need to understand, she continued, about those files, about you, about... She stopped, started again. I need to know what I missed. Mason looked out the window at the rain falling on Mercer Street, at the people hurrying past with their umbrellas and their mournings, at the city that didn't know and wouldn't care about any of this. Yeah, he said, there's a lot you missed. He said it without anger, just the plain weight of the fact. And Natalie Sterling, who had built her career on being the most prepared person in any room she walked into, sat across from him with her untouched coffee and her circled log report, and the first real uncomfortable understanding that she had made a catastrophic mistake, and that undoing it was going to require her to listen to a man she had wronged in front of 40 witnesses, in a way that had cost him everything, and ask him for help. She was not used to asking for help, but here she was. The rain came down harder. Neither of them moved to leave. The rain was still falling when they left the coffee shop. They hadn't resolved anything exactly. What they'd done was establish that there was more to establish, which, given where they'd started 48 hours earlier, felt like significant territory. Natalie had asked Mason for a number she could reach him on directly, not through HR, not through legal. He'd given it to her without comment. She'd said she would be in touch within a day or two. He'd nodded, picked up his coffee cup, and left first. She sat at the corner table for another 10 minutes after he was gone, looking at the circled log report and thinking about the way he'd said I wrote them. Not with pride, not with bitterness, just with the flat, matter-of-fact weight of something that was simply true, and had always been true, regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it. She'd built her career on reading rooms and reading people, and she had missed him completely. That was the thing she kept returning to on the drive back to the office, sitting in the back of the car with her phone face down on the seat beside her for once. She'd looked at those logs and seen a name and made a decision, and she'd made it in front of 40 people, and the decision had been wrong. She didn't know yet how wrong. The full shape of it was still forming, but the wrongness was there and it had weight, and she was going to have to carry it. She was not good at carrying things she'd done badly. She was better at fixing them. She picked up her phone and called Howard Briggs. I need everything on the biometric authorization for the Saturday session, she said when he answered. Not the summary, the raw data. I want to know exactly how the registered device check cleared. A pause on his end. I can have that to you by end of day. By noon, she said. Another pause. Yes. She hung up and looked out the window at the rain-gray city going past. Howard Briggs had been in corporate security for 19 years, long enough to have seen evidence that looked airtight turn out to be Swiss cheese, and evidence that looked shaky turn out to be the most solid thing in the room. He'd been uncomfortable with the Mason Reed situation from the jump, not with Mason specifically, but with the cleanliness of the trail. In his experience, real corporate espionage was messy. People made mistakes, left traces they didn't intend, created anomalies in their behavior in the days before and after. What the Saturday breach logs showed was the opposite of that. They were almost too clean. Every access point logged correctly, the session path logical and efficient, the device authorization clearing without a hiccup. It had the quality of something that had been rehearsed. He'd flagged this in his initial report, in a subordinate clause that he suspected no one had read carefully. Now, pulling the raw biometric data at Natalie's request, he found what he'd half expected to find. The device authorization had cleared on Mason's registered phone, yes, but the authorization timestamp had a gap, 43 seconds between the credential entry and the biometric confirmation. Standard biometric auth on the company's system took between 3 and 8 seconds. 43 was anomalous. Not impossible, but anomalous. He stared at the number for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called a contact he had at the firm that had manufactured the company's authentication system. Mason spent Friday afternoon the way he'd spent most of the week, working from home on the consulting projects, making himself useful in the only space available to him, and trying not to check his email more than once an hour. He had 2 projects active, a data migration audit for a mid-sized logistics firm, and an infrastructure review for a healthcare startup that was about to scale and was worried about their architecture holding the weight. Good work, careful work, the kind that paid decently if you invoiced correctly and kept no one awake at night. He picked Chloe up at 3:30. She had paint on her left forearm that she said was from art class, and he suspected was from something less supervised. How was school? We learned about ecosystems. Yeah, what kind? Forest ecosystems. Did you know that when a tree falls, it becomes a habitat for like 100 different things? I did know that. It's like it's dead, but it's also useful. She thought about this. That's kind of nice. He glanced at her in the mirror. It is kind of nice. She looked out the window, satisfied with the concept. He drove and thought about 43 seconds in file directories and a man he hadn't identified yet who had used his name to carry something out the door. Saturday morning, Chloe talked him into pancakes again. She always talked him into pancakes on Saturday. The negotiation was a ritual. She would propose pancakes. He would express mild resistance on the grounds of time or ingredient availability. She would identify and dismantle both objections, and they would make pancakes. It had been going on since she was 5. We have the mix, she said. We might be out of syrup. She opened the cabinet and produced a bottle of syrup from behind the oatmeal she refused to eat. She set it on the counter with the conclusive air of someone who had anticipated this move. We have syrup, she said. I see that. She got out the mixing bowl. They made the pancakes together, which meant Chloe stood on her step stool and stirred the batter with the focused intensity of someone performing surgery. And Mason managed the stove and flipped them while she watched with the critical eye of a quality inspector. The first 2 were irregular and slightly overdone on one side. She ate them with great satisfaction. These are good, she said. The first batch is always the test batch. I like the test batch. He watched her eat. The morning light came through the kitchen window at a low angle, the way it did in October, and it caught the side of her face, and she looked for a moment so much like Laura that his chest did the thing it sometimes still did, a quick, involuntary tightening, not quite grief anymore, more like the muscle memory of grief, the way your body knows how to do something long after the reason for doing it has changed. He looked back at the stove. She was fine. He was fine. The pancakes were fine. Chab. Natalie called at 10:15 while Chloe was in her room conducting some kind of complex imaginative operation involving most of her stuffed animals and what sounded like a courtroom drama. I have Howard Briggs' raw data, Natalie said without greeting. There was a 43-second gap in the biometric authorization for the Saturday session. Mason was quiet for a moment. That's not normal. Howard contacted the 8th system manufacturer. 43 seconds can indicate a replay attack, Chub. Someone capturing the biometric signal from a previous valid authorization and replicating it with a delay introduced by the recording and playback process. Someone cloned the auth sequence, Mason said. That's what it's starting to look like. A pause. Which means whoever did this didn't just get your login credentials. They had to have your phone or access to its authorization data at some prior point. He thought about that. His phone. His credentials. A person who'd had access to both, close enough and long enough to capture what they needed. That narrows it, he said. Not enough yet, but it's moving. Another pause, and he could hear her choosing her next words carefully. I want to meet again, not a coffee shop this time. I want to come to you. He frowned. Why? You said you knew those files better than anyone in the building. I need to understand what's in them. Specifically, what someone would want badly enough to do this. I can't do that through the security team. They don't have the context. What I can tell you anywhere. Maybe, she said. But you also said that someone chose those files because certain people would rather they stayed buried. I need to know what certain people means, and I think that conversation is one you're more comfortable having somewhere that isn't neutral ground. He stood in the kitchen holding his phone, looking at the closed door of Chloe's room. Sunday afternoon, he said. 2 o'clock. I'll be there. He gave her the address and hung up. Howard Briggs spent Saturday in the security office with the door closed and the blinds at half-mast, working through a sequence of cross-references that he'd started Thursday and was now beginning to cohere into something he didn't like. He'd started with the 43-second gap because that's what Natalie had asked for. But once he was in the raw auth data, he'd kept going, because that was how Howard's brain worked, had always worked, couldn't turn it off if he tried. He pulled the access logs for the 60 days prior to the breach, not just Mason's, everyone's. He was looking for anomalies, for patterns, for the kind of subtle irregular behavior that preceded a planned action. What he found was not subtle. Across a period of 6 weeks, someone had been running low-level queries against the legacy architecture partition, the R folders specifically, from a terminal inside the building. The queries were small, each one innocuous on its own, the kind of exploratory access that could be explained away as routine system maintenance. But taken together, in sequence, they mapped a path through the partition's access controls. Someone had been learning the layout, learning where the files were, how the directories were structured, how the partition's security tiering worked. The terminal those queries originated from was in the executive suite. Howard printed the query logs. He held them for a while. He thought about the 43-second gap and the specific R folders that had been accessed, and the fact that those folders contained early development documents from a period most of the current staff didn't know about. Then he thought about who, in the executive suite, had the technical sophistication to understand what they were looking at. That thought narrowed the field considerably. He locked the printout in his desk and called Natalie's cell. She listened to Howard for 4 minutes without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Can you trace the terminal queries to a specific login?" Working on it. The queries were run with a system admin override that partially obscures the originating credential. I need another day. You have until Monday morning, she said. I'll have something by then. She ended the call. She was in her apartment, in the kitchen, with the printouts from the raw auth data on the table in front of her and a glass of wine she'd poured an hour ago and not touched. The apartment was quiet in the way that very expensive apartments in the financial district were quiet. A sealed, pressurized silence that had nothing to do with peace. She thought about the executive suite terminal. She thought about who had been on site the weeks leading up to the breach. She thought about the specific character of the files stolen. Not current operational data, not client lists, not financial records, but old architecture documentation from the company's pre-commercial period. Who would want those? Who would know they existed? Who had the technical baseline to understand their value? She didn't have a name yet, but she was starting to feel the shape of one. Sunday came in cold and clear, the first genuinely sharp October day, the kind where the light was good, but the wind had teeth. Natalie took a car rather than driving herself, which was partly habit and partly because she wanted to be able to think on the way over instead of navigating. Mason's apartment was in a part of the city that was neither run down nor aspirational, a neighborhood in the honest middle, with a laundromat on one corner and a decent pizza place on the other, and brownstones that had been subdivided into units sometime in the 80s and maintained with varying levels of dedication since. His building was a 4-story walk-up, brick, with an intercom panel by the front door that had half its labels missing. His was 3B. She buzzed. He answered without asking who it was, which meant he'd been listening for the sound. 3rd floor. The hallway smelled like someone's lunch, something with garlic. and the carpet was the color of a decision made in a previous decade. She found 3B and knocked. He opened the door. He was in jeans and a gray Henley, no pretense to the occasion. Behind him, the apartment was visible. A living room that was clean but lived in, the particular organized disorder of a space where a child also existed, a crayon on the coffee table, a small sweater on the couch arm, a bookshelf that held both engineering reference texts and picture books with no attempt to separate them. Standing in the middle of the living room, watching Natalie with frank, serious curiosity, was a small girl with dark hair and her father's steady eyes. "This is Chloe," Mason said. Natalie looked at the girl. Chloe looked back. "Hi," Natalie said. "Hi," said Chloe. Then directly, "Are you from Daddy's work?" "Yes." "Are you his boss?" A pause. "Sort of." Chloe absorbed this. "He doesn't really talk about work," she said, "except sometimes about the coffee machine." "The coffee machine's broken," Mason said, heading to the kitchen. "Sit down wherever. You want coffee?" "Please." Chloe followed Natalie's gaze around the room with the attentiveness of someone running a quiet assessment. Natalie sat on the far end of the couch and Chloe sat on the other end, not close, not distant, and picked up a book she'd apparently already been reading, a chapter book about a girl detective, and resumed it without further comment. Natalie looked at the bookshelf. She looked at the crayon on the coffee table. She looked at the small sweater on the couch arm, which had an embroidered cat on the pocket, slightly crooked, clearly put there by someone who had done it by hand and done it with love and probably not done it perfectly. She felt, unexpectedly and uncomfortably, like an intruder. Mason brought 2 coffees and set one in front of her. Chloe, without looking up from her book, said, "Can I have the good crackers?" "In the cabinet," he said. She put the book down and went to the kitchen. Mason sat in the chair across from Natalie, not next to her on the couch, not confrontationally far, just in the chair, at a normal conversational distance, and looked at her with the same level steadiness she'd seen in the conference room, in the coffee shop, on the phone. He was, she was realizing, a person who looked at you the same way regardless of context. It was either a very controlled thing or a very natural one. She hadn't decided which. "Before we start," he said, "I want to be clear about something. All right? I'm not doing this to get my job back. I don't know yet if I even want it back. What I want is my name clear. That's the transaction here." She held his gaze. "Understood. And I'm going to tell you things I haven't told anyone at that company. Some of it is going to be hard for you to hear." I figured. He picked up his coffee. "Okay." Chloe returned from the kitchen with a sleeve of crackers and installed herself back on the couch, book open, crackers on her knee, a 7-year-old in full coexistence mode. Mason began. But he told her about this beginning. Not the version in the press releases, not the founding mythology that Apex had polished into something clean and heroic over the years. The real version, which was messier and stranger and more human. 7 years ago, the company that became Apex Dynamics had been 4 people in a rented space above a Thai restaurant in a neighborhood that had since gentrified past recognition. The 4 were Mason, Laura, a systems architect named Patrick Osei, who'd since left the industry entirely, and a finance and operations person named Dana Cho, who'd moved to Singapore 2 years after the company incorporated. They'd been working on a framework for secure partition data architecture, the kind of system that could handle sensitive information at scale while maintaining airtight separation between data types. It wasn't a novel idea, but their approach to it was a layered partition logic they'd developed collaboratively, tested obsessively, and eventually codified into what became the R-series files. Laura had been the primary architect of the partition logic. Mason had built the integration layer, the way the partitions communicated with each other and with external systems. Together, it formed the technical foundation that made the whole thing work. They'd brought the framework to a venture firm as the basis of a new company. The venture firm had brought in professional management, which was standard, and had gradually, over the following 2 years, shifted the narrative of the company's origin toward the new leadership team and away from the founding engineers, which was also, unfortunately, standard. By the time Apex Dynamics went public, the R-series files were historical artifacts in a legacy partition, and the 4 people who'd built the foundation were mostly footnotes, if they were mentioned at all. Laura had been alive for the first 2 years of this. She'd been angry about it, quietly, and then less quietly. But she'd also been practical. She knew how these things went. She knew the legal agreements they'd signed. She knew that fighting it would cost more than it was worth when they had a baby coming and a life to build. She'd made peace with it in the way that intelligent people make peace with unfair things they can't change, which is not fully, but functionally. Then she'd gotten sick. And then she'd died. And after that, Mason had stopped caring about the credit entirely, because the credit felt like a very small thing compared to what he'd lost. He'd stayed at Apex in a reduced role, not because he needed the recognition, but because the work was good and the salary was stable and stability was what Chloe needed. He'd never mentioned the R-series files to his current supervisors. He'd never claimed the early history. He'd just done his job. Natalie listened to all of this without speaking. When he finished, the apartment was quiet except for the sound of Chloe turning a page. No one in the current company knew any of this? Natalie said finally. Howard Briggs might have suspected something. He's observant. Mason set his cup down. But formally, no. HR has me as a 3-year employee. The founding history isn't in my file because I never put it there. Why not? He looked at her. Because Laura was gone and I didn't see the point. A beat. And because I didn't want to have the conversation I'm having with you right now. Natalie looked down at her coffee. She was quiet for a moment. The R-series files, she said. If someone accessed them and understood what they were, understood the partition logic, architecture, what could they do with that information? Depends what they wanted, Mason said. The partition logic is the security backbone of the whole system. If you understand how the partitions communicate, you understand how to move data between them without triggering the anomaly detection. You'd know the exact gaps in the monitoring coverage. You could move data inside the system without being flagged. If you knew what you were doing, yes. She looked at him. Something had shifted in her face. Not dramatically, but the careful professional composure had thinned further, and what was underneath it looked like a person genuinely reckoning with something. Someone accessed those files, she said slowly, not to steal the architecture, to understand the architecture, so they could use it. That's what I think, Mason said. Use it to do what? He spread his hands. That's the question you need to answer. What's been moving inside your systems that shouldn't have been moving? She stared at him. I'm not inside the building anymore, he said. I can't look. But someone with executive-level access, with enough technical understanding to read those files and apply them, they've been doing something. The breach wasn't the crime. The breach was the cover. The silence stretched. From the couch, without looking up from her book, Chloe said conversationally, I don't know what you guys are talking about, but it sounds serious. It is a little serious, Mason said. Do you want more crackers? She asked, holding the sleeve out toward Natalie. Natalie blinked. She looked at the crackers. She looked at this 7-year-old who had offered them with complete sincerity and no awareness of the charged atmosphere in the room, or possibly complete awareness and a 7-year-old's pragmatic response to it. Sure, Natalie said. Thank you. Chloe nodded and went back to her book. They talked for another hour. Natalie took notes on her phone. Not in a performative way, but in the habitual way of someone who thinks through writing and can't help it. Mason walked her through the R-series architecture in plain language. Not the full technical detail, but enough for her to understand what she was looking at when she went back into the system logs. Enough for her to know what questions to ask Howard. At one point she said, flatly and without setup, I should not have done what I did in that meeting. He didn't respond immediately. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the arm of the chair. No, he said. You shouldn't have. I had the logs and I had the device authorization, and I thought it was clear. I know. I should have talked to you first. Yes, he said. You should have. She waited, as if expecting something more. Absolution, maybe, or at least the softening of the word yes into something more forgiving. He didn't offer it. He wasn't being cold. He just wasn't handing her something she hadn't earned yet. She found she respected that, even though it was uncomfortable. I'm going to fix this, she said. I know you're going to try, he said. Let's see what Howard finds. Howard found it Monday morning, 20 minutes before 8. The system admin override queries, the ones from the executive suite terminal, traced, once he'd peeled back the obfuscation layer, to a secondary credential that had been created 3 months ago under a maintenance ticket that had since been closed and buried in the system's administrative history. The secondary credential was tied to a user profile that didn't appear in the current employee directory, but the originating account that had created it, the parent credential, the one with the administrative clearance to generate new system access, belonged to the chief financial officer, Victor Langford. Howard sat very still for a moment, looking at the screen. Victor Langford had been with Apex Dynamics for 5 years. He was 51, well-regarded, on the short list for the board expansion. He played golf with 2 of the company's major investors. He had a reputation for methodical, conservative financial management that the board found deeply reassuring. He was also, Howard now understood, the person who had spent 6 weeks learning the layout of the company's most sensitive legacy architecture files, and had then used Mason Reed's credentials to remove them from the building. Howard picked up the phone. Natalie took the call in her car, on her way to the office. She listened without speaking. When Howard finished, she said, "Print everything, lock it, don't share it with anyone but me. I'll be there in 10 minutes. She ended the call. She looked out the window at the city. Victor Langford. Victor, who had been in that conference room on Tuesday, who had sat there and listened to her accuse Mason Reed and had not said a word. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to sit in a room while an innocent person was accused and say nothing, and she thought about the kind of person who could do that, who could watch it happen and keep their expression neutral and let it unfold because it was exactly what they'd intended. She felt something cold and specific settle over her. She told the driver to take the longer route, the one that passed the coffee shop on Mercer. She didn't know why. Habit, maybe. Or something that felt adjacent to apology, as close as she could get to one while sitting in a car with evidence of a catastrophic error beginning, finally, to clarify into something she could act on. The coffee shop went past. The rain from Friday was gone, and the morning was sharp and clear. She turned back to her phone and began drafting a message to the company's outside legal counsel. There was a lot of work ahead. She didn't know yet how it would land, how much damage had already been done, how many of the things Mason had lost in that conference room could actually be given back. Some of them probably couldn't. That was the truth of it, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But she knew the name now. And knowing the name was the beginning of everything. Howard's printouts were 17 pages, and Natalie read all of them twice before she called Mason. It was Monday afternoon, just past 1. She'd spent the morning in a closed-door session with Howard and the company's outside legal counsel, a sharp, unhurried woman named Carolyn Marsh, who had the specific quality of someone who had seen everything and been surprised by nothing and would tell you exactly how bad things were without softening the landing. Carolyn had reviewed the query logs, the auth-gap data, and the credential trail Howard had uncovered, and she'd said, in the same tone she might use to discuss the weather, "If this holds up under forensic audit, you have a significant problem with your CFO." "I know," Natalie had said. "You also have a significant problem with what happened to your systems engineer." "I know that too." Carolyn had looked at her. "Before we take any action against Langford, I need to understand the full evidentiary picture. If there are documents, internal records, early company files, anything that predates the current corporate structure, they need to be part of the forensic record." Which was why Natalie was now calling Mason. He picked up on the second ring. "I need to come back," she said. "Today if possible. I have our outside counsel with me, and we need to see whatever you have that documents your early involvement with the company's architecture." A silence on his end. Not a surprise silence, more like the silence of someone who had known this was coming and had been deciding quietly and privately whether they were ready. 6 o'clock, he said. "Chloe has a thing after school today. I need to pick her up and get her settled." 6 o'clock works. "Bring your lawyer," he said. "But she's there as a witness, not as an adversary. If she comes in swinging, I close the box and we're done." "Understood," Natalie said. She heard him exhale, just slightly, just enough to register. 6 o'clock, he said again, and hung up. The afternoon dragged. Natalie couldn't focus on anything that required more than 20 minutes of sustained attention, which described most of her afternoon calendar, and she got through her 3 o'clock budget review by autopilot, agreeing to things she'd normally push back on, and asking follow-up questions she'd normally already know the answers to. The deputy CFO, a woman named Sandra Price, who had been Langford's second for 4 years and was either complicit or oblivious, and Natalie genuinely didn't know which yet, ran the meeting with the flat efficiency of someone who hadn't heard anything yet and was operating in the last hours of a world that was about to change shape. Natalie watched Sandra's face throughout and found nothing. Either she was clean or she was very good. At 5:15, she left the building with Carolyn Marsh, who had spent the intervening hours in a borrowed conference room with Howard's printouts and her own laptop and a legal pad she'd filled on both sides. In the car, Carolyn said, "Tell me about the apartment we're going to." Single father, 7-year-old daughter. He's been an infrastructure engineer at Apex for 3 years, but his actual history with the company predates that significantly. He and his late wife were among the original technical architects. He's never formally asserted that history. Why not? His wife died. He stepped back. Natalie paused. I think he just wanted to be left alone. Carolyn considered this. And now he's been publicly accused of stealing documents he helped create. Yes. Carolyn looked out the window. I've been doing this for 22 years, she said. The thing that never stops surprising me is that the people who actually built something are always the last ones anyone thinks to protect. She said it without particular emotion, as observation rather than editorial. Then she opened her legal pad and went back to her notes. But Mason buzzed them in at 6:02. He'd put Chloe's dinner on. There was something on the stove that smelled like tomatoes and herbs. And Chloe herself was at the kitchen table doing homework, her pencil moving with the labored determination of someone who had opinions about math. He introduced himself to Carolyn with a handshake that was brief and assessing. She gave him the same back. They were, Natalie noticed, similar in a particular way. Both people who took the measure of a room quickly and didn't perform more warmth than they felt. I appreciate you seeing us, Carolyn said. Let's see how the evening goes before you appreciate anything, Mason said, which made Carolyn's mouth do something close to a smile. He settled Chloe with her homework and a promise that dinner would be ready in 20 minutes, and then he brought Natalie and Carolyn to the small second bedroom he used as a home office. It was a spare room, a desk, a chair, shelving with books and binders, and a few pieces of equipment. In the closet, behind the winter coat and the box of Chloe's outgrown clothes, was the wooden box. He brought it out and set it on the desk. Natalie had seen it during her first visit, noticed it the way you notice something that seems to hold weight, not because it was visually remarkable, but because of the care with which it had been preserved. The wood was dark and worn at the edges, the kind of wear that came from handling rather than age, from being moved and opened and closed many times over many years. The latch was simple brass, tarnished now. Mason stood with his hand on the lid for a moment. My wife made this, he said. Not the box itself. I made the box. She organized what went into it. He paused. After she died, I went through everything. A lot of things I threw out or donated because they didn't matter. This I kept, because she'd put it together deliberately, and I thought, he stopped. I thought that meant it mattered, even when I couldn't see why. The room was very quiet. He opened the box. What was inside was, on its surface, unremarkable. A collection of documents, some printed, some handwritten, some photocopied from originals. A USB drive in a small Ziploc bag, labeled in Laura's handwriting. A folded legal document that had been opened and refolded many times. 2 notebooks with marbled covers, the kind sold at any office supply store, filled with handwriting that alternated between Mason's blocky print and Laura's smaller tilted cursive. Carolyn moved closer. She looked at the top layer of documents without touching them. May I? She asked. Mason nodded. She picked up the folded legal document first, opened it carefully, and read. Her face did not change, but her stillness had a quality that Natalie had learned in the past few hours meant she was processing something significant. This is a contributor agreement, Carolyn said, signed by Mason Reed and Laura Reed, née Reyes, dated 7 years ago. It assigns joint development credit for the partition logic framework, what's labeled here as the RS architecture, to both of them and to the founding entity. She looked up. This predates the Series A. This predates the company incorporation under the Apex Dynamics name. Yes, Mason said. This was never filed with the company's legal record as it exists today? No. When the venture firm brought in new management and the company restructured under the current entity, a lot of the founding documentation was, I don't know if the word is lost or deprioritized. I was told the founding agreements had been absorbed into the new corporate structure. I didn't know enough about corporate law at the time to know that wasn't the same thing as being honored. Carolyn set the document down gently and picked up one of the marbled notebooks. She opened to a random page and read for a moment. She turned to another page, then another. These are development notes, she said. Laura's and mine, from the original build period. We kept parallel notebooks. She documented the architecture decisions. I documented the integration layer work. We did it because we were both paranoid about losing things. He paused. She was more paranoid than me, actually. She kept copies of everything. She used to say that if you built something real, you should be able to prove you built it. Carolyn looked at him over the top of the notebook. She was right. I know, he said. These notebooks, combined with the contributor agreement, and whatever's on this drive. She held up the USB in its bag. Do you know what's on the drive? Version-controlled build files, time-stamped commits from the original RS architecture development, Laura's final architecture specifications, my integration documentation. He paused. It's essentially the complete development record of everything in the R-series files. Carolyn set the drive down carefully, as if it were something fragile, which in the legal sense it was. She looked at Natalie. This changes the evidentiary picture significantly, she said, in the measured voice she used when she was saying something that had very large implications in a very small number of words. Natalie looked at the open box, at the worn notebooks and the tarnished latch and the folded agreement, and the small labeled drive in its Ziploc bag, at the 7 years of careful preservation that Laura Reed had started and Mason Reed had continued without fully knowing why. Mason, she said. He looked at her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. All right? Is there anything on that drive or in those notebooks that Langford could have used? Any technical detail specific enough that accessing the R-series files and cross-referencing this material would have given him something operational? He was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. The partition communication logic, he said slowly. The specific handshake sequence between the data tiers. It's in Laura's final architecture specs. She documented it in full because she was meticulous about documentation. If someone had the R-series files and also had the original specs, they'd have everything they needed to move data through the system without triggering alerts. Yes. Which means Langford wasn't just studying the R-series files to understand the system, Natalie said. He was studying them because he needed a piece of the puzzle he didn't have yet. She worked it through. He has the current system documentation through his executive access. But the partition handshake logic isn't in the current docs. It's in the legacy files, in a form that predates the current architecture vocabulary. He needed the original to decode the current. That's what it sounds like, Mason said. Carolyn had been listening to this with her legal pad out. What would he be moving? She asked. In practical terms, what data and to where? That's your question to answer, Mason said. I can tell you how the system works. I can't tell you what's been running through it for the past... He stopped. How long do you think this has been going on? Natalie and Carolyn looked at each other. Howard found preliminary queries going back 6 weeks, Natalie said. But the credential he created, the ghost account, it's 3 months old. Then you need to pull 3 months of inner partition transfer logs, Mason said. Not the summary reports, the raw logs. Look for transfers that cleared the anomaly detection cleanly. They'll look like normal system traffic, but if you know what the handshake sequence looks like, you can filter for it. Can you help us identify it? Carolyn asked. He looked at her. I designed the handshake sequence, he said. I know exactly what it looks like. From the kitchen, Chloe called, Daddy, the timer went off. The three of them stood in the small office for a moment in the specific silence of people who have just outlined something large and need a second to let it settle. Dinner, Mason said simply. He went to the kitchen, Natalie and Carolyn followed, because there was nowhere else to go, and the apartment was small, and the evening had made them, in some odd and uncomfortable way, temporarily domestic. Chloe had already gotten plates out, 2 for herself and her father, and was now looking at Natalie and Carolyn with the mild, calculating expression of a child revising a plan. "Are you staying for dinner?" she asked. "We don't want to intrude," Natalie said. "It's pasta," Chloe said. "There's probably enough." She looked at her father. "Is there enough?" "I can make enough," he said, already at the stove. Chloe nodded with the air of someone who has resolved an administrative matter and pulled 2 more plates from the cabinet. Natalie looked at Carolyn. Carolyn looked back with an expression that said, "I've eaten working dinners in stranger circumstances than this, and also I'm hungry." They stayed. The pasta was simple and good, something with canned tomatoes and fresh garlic, and a handful of herbs from a small pot on the windowsill that Chloe informed Natalie she had planted herself, though her father had done most of the watering. They ate at the kitchen table, Carolyn and Natalie on one side, Mason and Chloe on the other, which had the slightly surreal quality of a meal at which one party was investigating the other, and both were temporarily suspending that fact in favor of dinner. Chloe talked about her book. The girl detective had solved a mystery involving a stolen map, which Chloe found both satisfying and realistic. "Real mysteries always have something hidden," she explained to Carolyn, who was listening with the focused attention she gave everything. "You just have to find the right thing." "That's basically true," Carolyn said. Chloe seemed pleased to have this confirmed by a professional. She asked Natalie what her job was. Natalie said she ran the company where her dad worked. Chloe considered this. "Is that why you're here?" she asked. "Because of his job?" "Partly," Natalie said. "Is he in trouble?" "No," Natalie said, and she said it more firmly than she'd planned to. "He's not in trouble. Someone else made a mess, and your dad is helping us figure out how to clean it up." Chloe looked at her father. He was eating pasta and not volunteering anything, which was his standard mode of operation during difficult conversations. Let the other person carry as much as they were willing to carry, say less than you could. "Okay," Chloe said, and went back to her food. After dinner, Mason told Chloe it was time to start getting ready for bed. She objected on 3 separate grounds, all of which he addressed with the patient, systematic efficiency of someone who had heard every version of this argument and knew exactly how long each one took to dismantle. She went, eventually, making her way down the hall with the dragging gait of someone lodging a formal protest through the medium of walking speed. Natalie and Carolyn cleared the table. "You don't have to," Mason started. "You made dinner," Natalie said. He looked briefly uncomfortable with that, which she suspected was less about the dishes and more about the implied intimacy of the gesture, the way that clearing someone's dinner table was a thing that moved you from one category of relationship into another. But he let it go and went to handle Chloe's bedtime, leaving them alone in the kitchen for the first time. Carolyn rinsed plates with the practiced efficiency of someone who had raised children. Natalie stacked them and found, on the shelf above the sink, a small framed drawing. Chloe's work, obviously, crayon on construction paper, 2 figures of unequal size standing in front of something green. Underneath, in the careful block letters of a child learning to write, "Me and Daddy at the park." She looked at it for a moment. "You're recalibrating," Carolyn said beside her, not looking up from the sink. "I made a decision in front of 40 people based on clean evidence that wasn't actually clean," Natalie said. "I'm not recalibrating, I'm reckoning." "Same thing, different pace." "It's not the same thing." Natalie set the plate down. "Recalibrating is a corrective process. What I'm doing is slower than that." She paused. "I stood up in that room and I said his name like a verdict. He has a 7-year-old and a box his dead wife kept and a job he's been doing quietly for 3 years. And I said his name in front of 40 people like it was settled fact." Carolyn turned off the water. She dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle and looked at Natalie with the frank, even gaze that was apparently just how she looked at everything. "That's true," she said, "and the correct response to that truth is what you're already doing, finding the actual culprit and restoring his standing. The guilt you're carrying is real, and it belongs to you. Don't put it down too fast, but don't let it stop you from moving either." She folded the dish towel neatly. In my experience, the people who move the slowest after they've made a mistake are the ones who'd rather feel bad about it than fix it. You're a fixer, so fix it. Natalie stared at her. You're very direct, she said. You hired me because I'm very direct, Carolyn said. Mbisam. Mason came back from putting Chloe to bed looking slightly less composed than when he'd left. The specific dishevelment of a parent who has negotiated bedtime in good faith and come out of it approximately even. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the clean counter and the stacked plates. You didn't have to do that, he said again. We wanted to, Natalie said, and this time he didn't argue. They moved back to the office. Carolyn had her legal pad and was already thinking several steps ahead. Natalie could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way she sat, the focused preparation of someone building a sequence in their mind. Here's where we are, Carolyn said. We have Howard's evidence tying Langford to the preliminary access. We have the auth gap indicating a replay attack. We have the ghost credential and the administrator trace. What we don't have yet is proof of what he was actually moving through the system, and we don't have a clear picture of what he did with it externally. She looked at Mason. The partition transfer logs. How long would it take you to go through 3 months' worth and identify transfers that use the handshake sequence? Depends on the volume, Hen, Mason said. If I have direct system access, which I don't, maybe a day. If I'm doing it blind from outside with someone running queries for me, he paused. I'd need Howard. Howard's trustworthy, Natalie said. I need to be the one running the query parameters, not him. He doesn't know what he's looking for. The sequence is subtle enough that without knowing the original architecture, it would look like normal interpartition traffic. Carolyn nodded. I can arrange temporary restricted access through our forensic process. It's defensible because you're the document holder on the original architecture. You have a legitimate technical basis to be involved in the analysis. When? Tomorrow morning, if we move quickly tonight. Mason looked at the box on the desk. He looked at the USB drive in its labeled bag. I'm going to need to make a copy of that drive before it goes anywhere, he said. And the notebooks. I'm not giving you the originals until there's a formal evidentiary protocol in place. That's correct procedure, Carolyn said. We'll establish chain of custody first thing tomorrow. She paused. For what it's worth, Mr. Reed, what's in that box combined with Howard's evidence is enough to initiate a formal action against Langford. But to understand the full scope of what he did, the financial manipulation, the insider trading, whatever he's been running through your system, we need the transfer logs. That's the piece that shows what the crime actually was, not just how it was set up. Mason was quiet. He was looking at the box in the way he sometimes looked at Chloe when she was sleeping, with the specific quality of attention that you give to things that have cost you something. Laura would have wanted this used, he said finally, and it wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. Neither Natalie nor Carolyn answered because it wasn't a question and because it was clearly true. They left at 8:30. The night outside was cold and clear, the city doing what cities do at night, running at a lower frequency, not quieter exactly, just differently loud. Carolyn had a car waiting. She got in, already on her phone, already moving to the next thing on the chain. Natalie stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She looked up at the building, 4th floor, the windows of 3B lit warm against the dark. She could see the edge of the kitchen light, the bookshelf visible through the glass, the small geography of Mason Reed's life arranged in those lit rectangles. She thought about the wooden box, about Laura Reed's handwriting in the margins of a marbled notebook, meticulous and small, documenting things she'd built and known she'd built, even when no one else was paying attention. About the USB drive labeled in the careful hand of a woman who understood that someday someone would need to know where the truth was kept. Natalie had run a company for 14 months. She'd made hundreds of decisions, some of them difficult, some of them with consequences she'd tracked carefully. She'd been thorough, she'd been prepared. She'd walked into every room knowing more than most people in it, and she had missed this. She'd missed the man, and the box, and the whole buried history of the things she was running, and she'd stood up in a conference room and pointed her finger at him in front of 40 people because the clean evidence said to. The window above her stayed lit. She turned and got in the car. Tomorrow would be long. There was a CFO to dismantle, a board to brief, a forensic process to set in motion. There were transfer logs to analyze and a ghost credential to trace and a full accounting of what Victor Langford had been running through Apex Dynamics' most secure data channels for 3 months, using tools he'd stolen from the man who built them. It was going to be messy, and it was going to be public, and it was going to cost her something, because these things always did. But she knew where the truth was now. That, at least, was a beginning. In the apartment upstairs, Mason sat in the chair in his office for a while after they left. The wooden box was still open on the desk. He reached in and picked up one of the marbled notebooks, Laura's, not his, the one with her handwriting dense and precise on every page. He didn't open it, he just held it. From down the hall, he heard Chloe's voice, drowsy and faint. "Daddy?" "Yeah," he called back. "Is the meeting over?" "Yeah, everyone went home." A pause. "Was it a good meeting?" He looked at the notebook in his hand, at the box his wife had assembled, patiently and without knowing exactly why in the last years of her life. At the drive in its labeled bag, still sitting on the desk, 7 years of careful keeping about to finally matter. "It was a pretty good meeting," he said. Silence from the hall, then, "Okay, good night." "Good night, Chloe." He sat in the quiet for another minute. Then he put the notebook back in the box, closed the lid, and turned off the light. The forensic access came through at 7:48 Tuesday morning, 40 minutes before Mason had planned to be at his desk. Carolyn had moved fast. She'd drafted the restricted access authorization the night before, had it signed by the board's legal liaison at 6 a.m., and sent the credentials to Howard Briggs by 7:15 with instructions that were precise enough to leave no room for interpretation. Mason's access was read-only, limited to the partition transfer logs, time-stamped and logged at every entry point, with Carolyn herself listed as supervising counsel. It was the kind of access that said, "We are doing this correctly in full view with documentation because we know exactly how this is going to be scrutinized later." Mason sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and a coffee and the authorization document open in one window and the Apex system portal in another. He'd gotten Chloe to school early. She'd had questions about why he was up before 6, which he'd deflected with the efficiency of a parent who'd been doing this for years. And now the apartment was quiet, and the morning light was flat and gray through the kitchen window, and he had 3 months of partition transfer logs to work through. He started at the beginning. The logs were dense, the way system logs always were. Thousands of entries, most of them routine, flagged and cleared by the anomaly detection system with the automated certainty of a machine that didn't know what it didn't know. What Mason was looking for was not an anomaly. That was the problem, and the point. Whatever Langford had been doing had been specifically designed to look like normal traffic. It would clear the automated checks because the handshake sequence it used was technically valid. It was the original architecture's own logic, turned against itself. He filtered by transfer type first, then by partition pathway, then by timestamp, looking for the sessions that ran outside normal business hours, the ones that happened at 11 p.m. or 3 a.m. or on Sunday afternoons when the building was mostly empty and monitoring was lightest. By 9 o'clock, he had 14 candidate sessions. By 10:30, he had confirmed 6 of them. He called Howard. "I'm sending you 6 session IDs," Mason said when Howard picked up. "I need you to pull the full transfer records for each one, originating partition, destination partition, file types, and payload size." "You found them," Howard said. It wasn't a question. "I found what he moved. I need you to help me figure out where it went." He heard Howard typing, a pause. Then, "These all route through the external interface layer. The destination addresses are..." A longer pause. "These are flagged as routine client report exports." "They're not." "No," Howard said slowly. "The payload sizes are wrong for client reports. These are..." He stopped. "Mason, these are financial model transfers, full data sets, not summaries." "What kind of financial models?" "I'd need a financial analyst to tell me what's in them specifically, but the file architecture..." Howard's voice had gone the particular flat quality that meant he was processing something bad. "These are structured like the kind of files you'd use to model forward-looking transactions, projections, possibly deal structure." Mason sat back. He looked at the ceiling. The water stain shaped like a duck looked back at him. He was moving proprietary deal data to an external address, Mason said. 3 months of it. At minimum, Howard said. And the breach on Saturday, stealing the R-series files, that was the final piece. He needed the partition handshake logic to make the transfer pathway invisible. He'd been building to it. Mason was working it through as he spoke. The 6 sessions I identified, those were when the monitoring coverage was lowest. But once he had the original architecture specs, he could run it any time without worrying about detection. He was about to scale up, Howard said. Yes. A silence on the line. Who knows about this besides you and me? Howard asked. Natalie, Carolyn Marsh. Not Langford's office. No. Good, Howard said. Because Sandra Price has been in his office 3 times this morning, and she doesn't usually do that. A beat. I don't know if that means anything. Keep watching it, Mason said. And Howard, don't run the payload analysis from inside the building. Use the forensic server Carolyn set up. I don't want Langford's ghost credential catching a query flag. Already on it, Howard said. He hung up. Mason looked at his laptop screen, at the 6 confirmed session IDs lined up in a column, at 3 months of financial data walking out of Apex Dynamics through a door that shouldn't have existed, built from an architecture that Mason and his wife had designed in an office above a Thai restaurant when they were 30 years old and certain that what they were building mattered. It had mattered, just not in the way they'd intended. He closed the laptop, put on his coat, and drove to the Apex building. He hadn't been inside since the morning Howard's IT technician had escorted him out with his cardboard box. Walking back through the lobby felt like a physical experience distinct from what he'd expected. Not triumphant, not dreadful, just strange. The way a place feels when the last time you were in it, something significant happened, and the place itself doesn't know that. The lobby security guard checked his temporary authorization credential without expression and waved him through. He took the elevator to the 14th floor, executive level, not his usual floor, and found Natalie's assistant Priya waiting by the elevator bank, which meant Natalie had been tracking his ETA. She's in the large conference room, Priya said. Carolyn Marsh is already there. Howard Briggs is on his way up. Is Langford in the building? Priya hesitated, just slightly. His assistant says he's in back-to-back meetings until noon. Does he know anything's happening? Not from us. Mason nodded and followed her down the hall. The large conference room on the 14th floor was not the same room where the accusation had happened. That room was smaller, on the south side of the building, and Mason was aware of not looking toward it as he passed. The large conference room was a different space, bigger, with a long table that seated 20 and a wall of windows facing east. The city spread out gray and bright below. Natalie was standing when he came in, which was how she almost always was. Standing, moving, doing something. She looked like she'd been up since 5, which she probably had. There were 2 laptops open on the table, and Carolyn Marsh sat at one end with her legal pad and a coffee and the expression of someone who had made a list and was working through it with purpose. You found the sessions, Natalie said when Mason came in. It was the same non-question quality Howard had used. 6 confirmed, he said. Howard's running the payload analysis now. We'll know what's in them within the hour. He set his laptop bag on the table and sat down. Tell me what you know about Langford's outside activity. Investments, consultancies, anything that would explain who he was sending this data to. Natalie looked at Carolyn. We ran a background poll last night, Carolyn said. Victor Langford has a clean public profile, so no disclosed conflicts of interest, no public investment positions in competing firms. But there's a private investment vehicle registered in Delaware 18 months ago, listed under a family trust name. It's been dormant on paper. I have a financial forensics contact running a deeper trace on it this morning. 18 months, Mason said. That's 6 months before the ghost credential was created. He's been planning this for a while, Carolyn said. The financial vehicle was the exit structure. The credential and the data transfers were the mechanism. What was he selling? Mason asked. Best current hypothesis? Carolyn set down her pen. Apex is in preliminary discussions with 2 potential acquisition targets, both in the healthcare data space. Those negotiations are confidential. If someone outside the company knew the deal structure, the timeline, the valuation models, they could position themselves in the target company's equities before an announcement. The kind of move that looks like smart investing until you trace the information source. Insider trading, Mason said flatly. At minimum. Possibly also the sale of proprietary competitive intelligence to a third party. There are some unusual activity patterns in the equities of Apex's two main competitors over the past 3 months that our forensic contact is also looking at. Mason sat with that for a moment. Victor Langford, 51, well-regarded, conservative, methodical. A man who had apparently spent a year and a half building a mechanism to walk confidential corporate data out through the back door of the company's most secure systems, and had framed a quiet infrastructure engineer for the theft of the architecture documents he'd needed to make the mechanism invisible. He picked me specifically, Mason said. Natalie looked at him. He needed someone with plausible access to the R-series files. Someone who could have theoretically had a technical reason to go into the legacy architecture partition. He ran through the org chart and picked the person whose credentials would raise the fewest immediate questions. He paused. He didn't know I'd built those files. He just needed someone with enough system seniority to make the access look possible. That's what I think, Natalie said. The irony being that the one person he picked to frame is the one person who can actually read those logs and tell you exactly what he did with the information. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the door opened and Howard Briggs came in, carrying a laptop and a printed report that was thicker than the last one. He looked like a man who had not slept well and had spent his morning staring at things he wished he hadn't found. He sat down, opened the laptop, turned it so the screen faced the table, and said without preamble, "The payload analysis is done. I need everyone to look at this." What Howard had found was this. Across the 6 confirmed transfer sessions, Langford had moved 437 files from the internal financial modeling partition to an external address that routed through 3 intermediary servers before landing, eventually, at a private cloud storage account registered to an entity called Meridian Capital Advisory, LLC, the Delaware trust Carolyn had flagged the night before. The files included complete deal structure models for both of Apex's acquisition targets, internal valuation analyses, due diligence summaries, timeline projections for announcement windows, a full competitive analysis of Apex's position against its 2 main rivals, including proprietary performance metrics that had never been disclosed publicly. There was also a folder labeled in the system's file naming convention, Personal, which was the kind of label you used when you wanted something to look routine, because everyone had files labeled Personal and no one looked at them twice. Inside the Personal folder were 31 documents that were not personal. They were communications, not emails, because Langford was careful about company email, but data files structured as message logs, the kind that came from encrypted external platforms that weren't connected to the company's communication infrastructure. Carolyn had her reading glasses on and was going through them at speed. "These are negotiation logs," she said, after 3 minutes of silence. He's been in direct communication with a third party about the data, someone who was directing the information requests. She looked up. He wasn't just trading on this himself. He was selling it. To who? Natalie asked. The counterparty identifier in these logs is a code name. Meridian references it as the advisor. I'll need the forensic team to trace the communication architecture, but she pulled off her glasses. Based on the deal knowledge these logs reference, specific terminology about both acquisition targets that only someone with deep industry knowledge would use, my strong suspicion is that this is a competitor, someone who wanted to know what Apex was building before Apex could build it. The room absorbed this. Natalie was standing very still at the window. The city below was going about its Tuesday morning completely indifferent to what was happening on the 14th floor, which was how cities worked, which she normally found useful and right now found slightly absurd. "He's been selling our competitive position," she said, "not just trading on it, actively selling it. For at minimum 3 months, probably longer," Carolyn said. "The 6 sessions Mason identified are the ones that cleared the anomaly detection. There may be earlier attempts that triggered flags and were caught by the system. We need to pull those too, because those would show the development of the method before he perfected it." "And the breach?" Howard said. Stealing the R-series files. That was to upgrade the method, to make it undetectable going forward. He was about to go bigger, Mason said. Howard nodded. The last session before the breach was 3 weeks ago. He went quiet for 3 weeks, which is consistent with waiting for the architecture documents to give him the next capability level. Once he had those, the volume could have increased by an order of magnitude. Instead, he triggered the breach investigation and we started pulling the thread, Natalie said. Instead of that, Howard agreed. The silence in the room had a different quality now. It was the silence of people who had the full picture and were standing at the edge of what came next. Mason looked at his hands on the table. He thought about the morning 2 weeks ago when he'd stood on the sidewalk outside this building with a cardboard box in the cold, not crying because he wasn't going to cry on a public street, but feeling the specific weight of a reputation dismantled in 4 minutes in front of 40 witnesses. He thought about Chloe in the back seat asking how his day was. He thought about Daniel Cho's careful, I know in the hallway, trying to prepare him for a verdict that had already been rendered. He thought about Victor Langford sitting in that conference room, watching. Where is he right now? Mason asked. 11th floor, Natalie said. He has a meeting with the investor relations team at 11. He doesn't know any of this is happening? No. She looked at him. I've kept this completely contained. You, me, Howard, Carolyn. That's the full list. When are you moving on it? Natalie looked at Carolyn. We need 2 more things before we go to the board, Carolyn said. The earlier session logs, but the ones that triggered anomaly flags, to establish the timeline, and the communication trace on the counterparty. I can have both by end of day. She paused. If we move before we have those, Langford's legal team will argue the 6 sessions are ambiguous. With the earlier attempts and the counterparty ID, the picture is airtight. End of day, Natalie said. It wasn't a question. End of day, Carolyn confirmed. Mason nodded slowly. 1 more day. He'd been carrying this for 2 weeks. 1 more day was nothing and also enormous, the way a last mile always was. Fine, he said. Victor Langford ate lunch in his office, as he usually did on Tuesdays. He had a standing order from the deli on the ground floor. A turkey club, chips, a sparkling water, which his assistant placed on his desk at 12:30. He ate at his desk because he liked to work through lunch, and because he'd spent 25 years in finance developing the discipline of a man who didn't waste the middle of the day. He was 51, trim, silver-haired in a way that read as distinguished rather than old, with the practiced ease of someone who had been competent for so long that competence had become indistinguishable from his personality. People trusted him. Boards trusted him. Investors trusted him. He'd cultivated that trust with the same methodical care he brought to everything else, consistently, patiently, over years. He was also, at this particular Tuesday lunch, slightly uneasy in a way he couldn't pin down. The Reed situation had resolved cleanly, or it had seemed to. The man had been publicly accused, suspended, and was apparently cooperating with the investigation in some capacity, which was odd but not alarming, because what could he say? The logs were clean. The credential trail was clean. Langford had been careful. But Natalie Sterling had been reviewing the logs herself, which was not standard CEO behavior. And Howard Briggs had his door closed more than usual. And Sandra Price, when he'd asked her this morning to run a routine data request through the system, had hesitated, just slightly, just enough, before saying she'd take care of it. Sandra never hesitated. He ate his sandwich and thought about this, carefully and without panic, the way he thought about everything. He reviewed his steps. He reviewed the access trail he'd left and the access trail he hadn't left and the gap between them. He thought about the ghost credential, which was buried under 3 layers of system admin history and would require a forensic-level audit to find. Had they done a forensic audit? He didn't know. He finished his sandwich, threw away the wrappers, and opened his laptop to check the financial models he'd been working on. Legitimate ones, quarterly projections, the kind of thing he did every week and could be interrupted doing without suspicion. His screen showed the models, and also showed in the corner of his desktop a small notification from the security system, access request approved, restricted forensic protocol RFP-1147, partition transfer log review, Authorized users: M. Reed, C. Marsh, H. Briggs. He stared at the notification for 4 seconds. Then he closed his laptop very carefully, stood up, and walked to his window. Mason Reed. Reviewing partition transfer logs. Under a forensic protocol. He had designed the transfer pathway to be invisible to current system staff. He had not accounted for the original architect. He stood at the window for a long time, looking at the city below. Then he went back to his desk, opened his laptop, and did 3 things in rapid succession. He initiated a remote wipe of the Meridian Cloud account, he sent a single encrypted message to the counterparty, and he cleared the browsing history on his work machine. He was, as always, methodical. What he didn't know was that Howard Briggs had flagged his account for activity monitoring at 6 a.m. that morning, and that every keystroke of the past 40 minutes had been captured in a system log that he could not reach and could not wipe. Howard's phone lit up at 1:47 p.m. He read the alert. He read it again. He picked up his desk phone and called Carolyn Marsh's mobile. "He just tried to wipe the Meridian account," he said when she answered, and he sent a message to the counterparty. "We have both." A beat of silence, then, "Did the wipe complete?" "No, the forensic protocol I set up this morning, it created a shadow copy of the account before he had access to initiate deletion. The files are intact, and the message he sent..." Howard pulled up the capture. "It's encrypted, but the recipient address resolves to a known entity. I'm sending it to your forensic contact now, but I'm looking at the domain, and it's registered to..." "Don't say it on this line," Carolyn said. "Come to the 14th floor. Bring everything." They were all back in the large conference room by 2:15. Howard, Natalie, Carolyn, Mason. The afternoon sun had broken through the gray and was coming through the east windows at an angle, putting a long bar of light across the conference table, which nobody remarked on. Howard put the new captures on screen. The Meridian remote wipe attempt was time-stamped 1:43 p.m. The shadow copy created by Howard's forensic protocol at 6 a.m. had captured the full account contents before the wipe could execute. The account contained, in addition to the 437 transferred files, a structured communication archive between Langford and the counterparty. 63 messages spanning 16 months, negotiating the sale of Apex Dynamics competitive intelligence to a firm called Verata Group. Verata Group was one of Apex's 2 main competitors. Carolyn read the communication archive summary with her reading glasses on, and the particular stillness of someone absorbing the dimensions of something large. When she finished, she took her glasses off and said, "This is not just insider trading. This is a sustained, negotiated corporate intelligence operation. He has been selling material, non-public information to a direct competitor for 16 months, including forward-looking deal structure on both acquisition targets, proprietary system performance data, and client contract terms on at least 4 major accounts." The room was silent. "The encrypted message he sent when he saw the forensic notification," Howard said. "The forensic contact traced the recipient. It went to a private address associated with Verata's chief strategy officer." Natalie looked at the screen. Then she looked at Mason. He was sitting at the table with both hands flat on the surface, not tense, not triumphant, just present. A man who had been waiting for this, and was now watching it arrive with the expression of someone for whom the relief and the damage are the same size, and neither one cancels the other out. "It's enough," she said. "We go to the board today." "Yes," Carolyn said. "What about Langford? Does he know how much we have?" "He knows we found the transfers," Howard said. "He doesn't know we have the Meridian archive or the communication logs. He thought he wiped it." "We need to move before he lawyers up," Carolyn said. "Once he calls outside counsel, the timeline changes. If we go to the board now, this afternoon, we can have him walked out before end of business." Natalie nodded. She looked steady, the way she looked when she was moving toward something difficult and had accepted the difficulty in advance. "Set the board call for 4 o'clock. Full emergency session. I'll have Priya reach every member. I want legal, forensic documentation, and Howard's full report on the call." She turned to Mason. "You don't have to be on the call. This is the company's problem to handle." "I know," he said. "But I'd like you to be available in case the board has technical questions about the architecture evidence." "I'll be here," he said. The board call went for 2 hours. Mason sat in a smaller conference room down the hall with a coffee he didn't drink and his laptop open to nothing in particular. He could hear, or thought he could hear, the very faint murmur of voices from the large conference room. Natalie's clearer than the others, the even precision of Carolyn's, the flattened questions of board members processing something they hadn't seen coming. He thought about what he'd said to Chloe the night before. A pretty good meeting, he'd meant it as reassurance. Hadn't been entirely sure it was true. Was now, he thought, more sure. At 4:40, Priya knocked on the conference room door and told him that security was escorting Victor Langford from the building and the board had requested a short briefing from him directly. He stood up. He straightened his shirt. It was the same gray Henley he'd been wearing all day, which was not ideal for a board briefing but was what it was. He thought briefly about the cardboard box he'd carried out of this building 2 weeks ago, the coffee mug and the charging cable and the drawing Chloe had made at the park. Then he went to meet the board. He was in the large conference room for 20 minutes. He answered their questions plainly and specifically about the R-Series architecture, about the partition handshake sequence, about how the transfer pathway had been constructed, and why it had been invisible to current system staff. He didn't editorialize. He didn't explain his history with the company unless they asked, and they did ask, and he told them the short version, which was sufficient. A board member named Gerald Whitmore, older, silver-haired, the kind of man who had seen several corporate crises and approached each one with the specific tiredness of experience, looked at him for a long moment after the technical explanation was finished and said, "You designed the original architecture." "My wife and I did," Mason said, "jointly." "And you've been working here for 3 years without disclosing that." "Yes." "Why?" Mason looked at him. "Because I didn't need the credit. I needed the salary." A beat. And because it wasn't relevant to my job until someone made it relevant. Whitmore held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked away. Another board member, younger, a woman named Patricia Cole, who Mason had seen at company events and never spoken to, said, "The accusation that was made against you in this building 2 weeks ago, in front of the department." "Yes," Mason said. "The board would like to formally—" "We can discuss what comes next separately," Mason said, quietly but clearly. "I don't need it done in a meeting." Cole looked at him. Then she nodded, once. Natalie, sitting at the head of the table, was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize, something between respect and the residue of guilt, the specific face of someone who was watching a consequence of their own action and taking the full measure of it. He didn't look away from it, which says. He left the building at 6:45, which meant he was late for pickup and had to call Mrs. Pellegrino, Chloe's after-school care provider, who was understanding in the brisk, professional way of someone who had been dealing with working parents for 20 years and had heard every version of running late. He got Chloe at 7:15. She was in Mrs. Pellegrino's kitchen eating a bowl of cereal. The good kind, apparently, because she was eating it without complaint. And she looked up when he came in with the particular expression she had when she'd been waiting a while and was choosing not to make it a thing. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "It's okay." She slid off the chair. "Can we have pancakes for dinner? It's too late for real dinner." "Pancakes for dinner is real dinner." "Mrs. P says breakfast food for dinner is not a meal." "Mrs. P is wrong," Mason said, and from the kitchen counter Mrs. Pellegrino made a sound that was either disagreement or suppressed amusement. They drove home. The city was doing its evening thing, lights coming on, traffic settling into its slower nighttime pattern, the particular quality of a Tuesday winding down. Chloe sat in the back seat and told him about a disagreement she'd had at school with a boy named Trevor, who insisted that sharks were the scariest animal, and she had argued, correctly, that it depended entirely on where you were and what you were doing. "If you're on land, sharks aren't scary at all," she said. "That's true," Mason said. Trevor wasn't thinking about context. "Context is important." She nodded with satisfaction. "What happened at work today?" He thought about the board call, about Victor Langford being walked out by security, about the wooden box and its contents and Carolyn Marsh's reading glasses, and Howard's forensic protocol capturing a wipe attempt that hadn't gotten through, about the 2 hours he'd spent in a conference room on the 14th floor, and what it had meant, and what it hadn't resolved, and what was still, honestly, unsettled. A lot, he said. But I think the hard part is mostly over. The misunderstanding? Yeah, he said. The misunderstanding. She looked out the window. The streetlights were coming on, one by one, down the long straight road toward home. Good, she said, simply and finally, the way she sometimes said things. Without excess? Without elaboration. Just the one word that was enough. He drove. The heater hummed. The city scrolled past. Daddy? Yeah. Can I put chocolate chips in the pancakes? We don't have chocolate chips. I found some in the back of the cabinet. He almost laughed. Actually, almost laughed. The kind that starts in the chest and gets most of the way out. Yeah, he said, sure, chocolate chips. She settled back in her seat, satisfied. Outside, the city moved around them, indifferent and alive, doing what it always did, carrying people from where they were to where they needed to be, without ceremony, without commentary, in the honest, ordinary light of a Tuesday evening. At that same moment, 3 miles east and 22 floors up, Victor Langford was sitting in his car in the building's parking structure, not driving yet, with his phone in his hand and his lawyer's number on the screen, and the understanding, finally and fully, that the thing he'd spent 16 months building had come apart in a single afternoon because a man he'd never properly considered had understood, better than anyone, exactly where to look. He sat there for a long time. Then he made the call. The pancakes that Tuesday night had chocolate chips in them and were slightly burned on one side, and Chloe ate 3 of them without mentioning the burned part, which was her version of being considerate. Mason stood at the stove and watched her eat, and felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, something that was close to stillness. Not resolution. The legal process was barely beginning. Carolyn had told him it would take months before anything was formally concluded, and there would be depositions and board proceedings, and a federal securities investigation that Carolyn had quietly indicated was likely once the Verrata connection was fully traced. There was nothing resolved yet in any official sense, but the thing that had been sitting on his chest since the morning in the conference room, the weight of 40 people looking at him and deciding, that was lighter now. Not gone. Lighter. He flipped the last pancake and burned the other side too, because apparently that was how the evening was going, and put it on his own plate. Yours are better than mine, he told Chloe. I know, she said. Wednesday came in cold and quiet. Mason got Chloe to school, came home, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with his phone face up for the first time in 2 weeks instead of face down. He was waiting for a call he knew was coming. Natalie had told him, before he'd left the building the night before, that the board wanted a formal meeting with him. Not a briefing, a meeting, with an agenda and a proposal. She hadn't told him what was in the proposal. He'd said he'd hear it. She called at 9:12. Can you come in this afternoon? She asked. 3 o'clock. Same building? Same building, different room. He almost said something about rooms, but let it go. I'll be there. He spent the morning finishing the partition transfer analysis documentation that Carolyn had asked for, a clean technical record, in plain language, of how the transfer pathway had been constructed and how it had been identified. It was the kind of writing he was good at, precise, sequential, no unnecessary flourish. He wrote it in 3 hours and sent it to Carolyn and Howard without reading it back, because he'd learned a long time ago that reading your own technical writing too many times made you start second-guessing things that were right the first time. Then he went to pick up Chloe's cereal, because he'd promised Thursday, and it was now Wednesday, and the window was closing on his credibility. He stood in the cereal aisle for 4 minutes, trying to remember which one she'd said was the good one, finally texted her teacher asking if there was any way to find out, received a reply 11 minutes later that said, I believe she mentioned something with stars on the box and bought 2 options to cover the range. He was, in almost every measurable way, a man who was doing fine. The meeting room on the 14th floor was not the large conference room with the east windows, and it was not the smaller room where the accusation had happened. It was a medium-sized room on the north side of the building that Mason had never been in before, which he suspected was intentional on someone's part. A room with no prior charge to it, a room that was just a room. Natalie was there. Carolyn Marsh was there. Gerald Whitmore, the senior board member who'd asked him why he hadn't disclosed his history with the company, was there in person, and two other board members were on screen. There was a printed document at the seat that had clearly been prepared for him, which he didn't open right away. He sat down. Natalie looked at him across the table. She looked like she'd been up most of the night, which he suspected she had, because she was the kind of person who worked through things by working, and there was a lot to work through. Her composure was intact, but the edges of it were frayed in a way that was oddly more reassuring than if she'd looked perfectly assembled. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You said there was a proposal," he said. "There is." She nodded toward the document in front of him. "You can read it fully and take as long as you need, but I'd like to walk you through it first, if that's all right." He left the document closed. "Go ahead." She walked him through it. It was thorough. The board had clearly spent the night on it, with Carolyn's guidance shaping the legal structure. The formal clearing of his name, to be communicated internally to the full company and externally as required by the breach disclosure process. A recognition of his and Laura's founding contributions to the RS architecture, to be added formally to the company's legal and historical record. Financial compensation for the 2 weeks of suspended employment and for the original founding contribution that had never been compensated at fair value. That number was in the document, and it was significant. And a position, Chief Architecture Officer, a newly created executive role overseeing the integrity of Apex's core technical infrastructure, reporting directly to the CEO. When she finished, the room was quiet. Mason looked at the closed document. Then he looked at Natalie. Then at Gerald Whitmore on the far end of the table, who was watching him with the careful patience of someone who had been in enough negotiations to know that the most important thing happening right now was not the proposal, but the person reading it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I want to talk about the financial compensation and the historical record separately from the position." Natalie nodded. "Of course. The compensation and the record, yes, that matters. Laura's name in the company's history matters." He paused. "The position..." He stopped again and took a breath and looked at his hands on the table. "I need to think about that." "Take whatever time you need," Whitmore said. "It's not about the role itself," Mason said. "Or the compensation. It's..." He looked for the right way to say it, the way that was honest without being a speech. "I'm a pretty good infrastructure engineer. I'm a decent architect. I know these systems better than most people here, and I could probably do the job adequately." He paused. "But I have a 7-year-old who eats cereal for dinner when I work late, and I've been doing this for 3 years, and I've structured my life so that she doesn't do that very often. An executive position isn't compatible with that life the way I've built it." The room was quiet. "That's the whole answer," he said. "It's not a negotiating position. It's just true." Natalie looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't quite read her expression. It wasn't disappointment, wasn't surprise, wasn't the particular executive reflex of trying to reshape the answer into something more convenient. It was something more like recognition, the look of someone seeing a thing clearly for the first time. "All right," she said. "I'd consider a consulting arrangement," he said. "Project-based. Defined scope, defined timeline, reasonable hours. That I can fit around Chloe." Carolyn, who had been writing steadily throughout, made a note. "We can structure that," Natalie said. "And the financial piece, I'd like a portion of it put into an education account for Chloe. Carolyn can advise on the structure." Carolyn made another note without looking up. "Already ahead of you," she said. Mason almost smiled. He looked back at the document, which he now opened, and spent the next 20 minutes reading it page by page, asking 3 specific questions about the legal language, accepting Carolyn's suggested revisions on 2 points, and eventually signing the pages that required signature. When he set the pen down, Gerald Whitmore said, "For what it's worth, Mr. Reed, the board should have known your history with this company. The fact that we didn't is a failure of our own oversight, not just Langford's concealment." Mason looked at him. "I didn't tell you," he said. "That's on me too." "Why didn't you?" He thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "Because after Laura died, this place..." He paused. "I didn't want it to matter anymore. I wanted it to be a job, not a history. A job is easier to walk away from at the end of the day. He paused again. I should have understood that you can't always choose what matters. Whitmore nodded slowly as if this answered something he'd been thinking about for longer than the past 24 hours. The meeting ended at 4:45. Mason took his copy of the signed document and his coat and went to pick up Chloe. The internal company announcement went out the following Monday morning. Natalie had written it herself, not with PR, not with the communications team, herself. And it said, plainly and without corporate euphemism, that the investigation into the October data breach had determined that Mason Reed bore no responsibility for the incident, that the actual perpetrator had been identified and removed from the company, and that Mason had been formally reinstated. It said that further disclosure would follow as required by legal process. It did not describe what Mason had contributed to the investigation. He'd asked that it not. It did say, in the final paragraph, that the company's historical record was being updated to properly attribute the RS architecture development to its original architects, Mason Reed and Laura Reed, and that this recognition was long overdue. Daniel Cho texted him at 8:47 a.m., 3 minutes after the announcement went out. Okay, so I have questions. Mason replied, I know. Are you coming back? Consulting, different thing. A long pause. Then, that tracks, actually. Coffee? Thursday. The harder conversation happened on a Thursday night, 2 weeks after the board meeting. Natalie showed up at his apartment unannounced, which was, he reflected, becoming a pattern he hadn't agreed to and also hadn't stopped. He opened the door and she was standing in the hallway in her coat with a paper bag from the Thai place 2 blocks over. The good one, not the one that delivered. And she said, I didn't know if you'd eaten. I took a chance. He looked at her for a moment. He looked at the bag. He stepped back and let her in. Chloe was on the couch with Gerald the rabbit and her chapter book, and she looked up when Natalie came in and said, with the comfortable familiarity of a child who had recalibrated quickly, Hi. Hi, Natalie said. I brought food. What kind? Thai, from the place on Meridian. Chloe considered this. Do they have the noodles with the peanut sauce? I got 2 kinds of noodles. One of them probably has peanut sauce. Chloe nodded with approval and went back to her book. Mason got plates without being asked, and they ate at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, with the Thai food spread between them and Chloe narrating the plot of her book between bites and the kitchen light warm and ordinary above them. It had the quality of a thing that had happened before, which it had, once on a Sunday in October when 2 lawyers were present and the stakes were higher, but this time with less weight and more peanut sauce, and Chloe telling Natalie that the girl detective in her book had solved 6 mysteries so far, and the 7th one was the hardest. Why is the 7th the hardest? Natalie asked. Because the person who did it was someone she trusted, Chloe said, matter-of-factly, around a mouthful of noodles. Natalie was quiet for a moment. Yeah, she said, that is usually harder. After dinner, after Chloe had been settled into her reading before bed routine, which she had agreed to with only moderate resistance, Mason and Natalie sat at the kitchen table with the remains of the food between them and the apartment quiet in the way it was when Chloe was in her room but not yet asleep, a quality of inhabited quiet, full rather than empty. I want to say something, Natalie said. Okay. I've said I was wrong. I've said it in the meeting, and I said it in the coffee shop, and I've said it in my head approximately 400 times since this started. She looked at him directly. But I haven't said it the right way. Not to you, specifically, without a lawyer in the room, and without it being part of a transaction. Mason was quiet. What I did in that conference room was not a mistake made from bad evidence. It was a mistake made from impatience. I looked at the logs and I decided fast because fast decisions in front of the team read as confident leadership, and I didn't slow down to ask whether the confidence was earned. She paused. That's not a system failure. That's a character failure. Mine. He looked at her. She held his gaze without flinching, which he'd noticed she was good at. Not as a power move, but as a genuine quality, the kind that came from being willing to stay in uncomfortable territory without looking for an exit. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to absolve me. I know that too. I just needed to say it without a table full of people between us. He looked down at the table for a moment, then back up. You found the thread, he said. When you could have closed the file and moved on, you didn't. You kept pulling. He paused. That matters. It's the minimum, she said. Maybe, but people don't always do the minimum. She was quiet. Laura used to say, he stopped, and the stopping was involuntary, the way it still sometimes was, 4 years on, the way you could be in the middle of a sentence and the fact of the past tense would catch you unexpectedly. He recovered. She used to say that the most important thing wasn't whether you got things right the first time. It was whether you could tell the difference between the times you got it wrong. He paused. She was better at it than me, honestly. Natalie looked at him. She sounds like she was a remarkable person. She was ordinary in most ways, he said. She was terrible at parallel parking, and she overwatered every plant she ever owned, and she had a habit of starting sentences and not finishing them when she got excited about an idea. He paused. But she was honest in a way that most people aren't. Not brutal, just honest. She believed that if you could see a thing clearly, you had an obligation to say so. He looked at the kitchen window, at the dark beyond it. She would have liked you, I think. You're irritating in some of the same ways she was. Natalie stared at him for a moment. Then something shifted in her face, the careful composure breaking open just slightly, not into tears, but into something close to laughter, a startled exhale of genuine surprise. That might be the most sideways compliment I've ever received. I meant it that way, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved just slightly, in a way it hadn't for 2 weeks. They sat in the kitchen for another hour. They talked about the investigation. Carolyn had indicated that federal securities regulators had formally opened a case following Carolyn's disclosure of the Verada connection, and Victor Langford had retained a defense team that was doing exactly what defense teams did, which was manage the timeline. But Carolyn believed the evidentiary picture was solid enough that the outcome was not in significant doubt. They talked about the company's architecture review that Mason had agreed to consult on, a systematic audit of the partition system to find and close the vulnerability Langford had exploited, and to update the current documentation to reflect the original architecture accurately. They talked about what Apex needed to do differently in the year ahead, which was a conversation Natalie drove and Mason contributed to with the specific, grounded perspective of someone who had watched a company from the inside of its own infrastructure for 3 years without a seat at the table. He said useful things. She listened in the way she hadn't, in October, listened, not just for confirmation of what she already thought, but for what she hadn't considered. When she stood to leave, Chloe appeared in the hallway in her pajamas, squinting in the kitchen light. You're still here, she told Natalie. I was just leaving, Natalie said. Okay, Chloe yawned. Are you coming back? Natalie looked at Mason. He gave her nothing. Just the steady, neutral look that was his default, the one that said, your answer, not mine. Probably, Natalie said. Chloe nodded as if this was satisfactory and shuffled back down the hall. Natalie picked up her coat. At the door, she paused and said, without turning around, for what it's worth, the consulting arrangement. It's good work. A beat. And you're right that it fits better. I know, he said. She left. He stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed, listening to the sound of the building settling, of Chloe turning in her bed down the hall, of the city doing its night things outside the window. He thought about what Carolyn had said in his kitchen the night she and Natalie had come to see the box. The people who actually built something are always the last ones anyone thinks to protect. He thought about Laura sitting at a kitchen table a lot like this one, in a rented space above a Thai restaurant, writing in a marbled notebook with her small, tilted handwriting, documenting something she believed mattered, even when the room wasn't paying attention. It had mattered. It just took 7 years and a corporate crime and a wooden box and a CEO who was willing to pull a thread until it came apart to prove it. That was not a satisfying timeline. There was nothing clean or just about it. Laura hadn't lived to see her name in the company's official record. The credit had come too late for the person who deserved it most. The compensation and the recognition and all of it. It was right, and it was also insufficient, and those two things were both true simultaneously, and Mason had learned in the 4 years since her death that simultaneous truths were something you either made peace with or spent your life fighting, and fighting them didn't change them. He turned off the kitchen light. Damn, November came in all the way, and with it the first real cold of the season. Not October's ambivalent chill, but the committed cold of a city settling into winter, the kind that made people walk faster and talk less and value, more than they usually did, the places they could go that were warm. Mason's consulting work with Apex started in the second week of November. 3 days a week, defined hours, a specific scope. He had a desk in the infrastructure department, not his old desk, a different one, which he preferred, and he worked his hours and left when his hours were done, and picked up Chloe at 3:30, the same as always. The arrangement had the quality of a thing that fit, which was the best a thing could do. Daniel Cho had adapted to the new arrangement with the easy flexibility of someone who had always suspected Mason was more than his title suggested, and was not particularly surprised to have this confirmed. They had coffee on Thursdays, same as before, and Daniel talked about his twins who were now in a phase that he described as physically exhausting, but also sometimes hilarious. And Mason talked about Chloe's ongoing relationship with her chapter book series, which had reached volume 9 and showed no signs of concluding. Howard Briggs, when they passed in the hallway, gave him a nod that carried more weight than nods usually did. Mason gave it back the same way. Sandra Price had been cleared of complicity in Langford's scheme. She'd been unaware, and the board had accepted that finding with some reservation but no action. She was now acting CFO pending a permanent hire, and the prevailing opinion was that she was doing the job better than her predecessor had, which was not a high bar, but she was clearing it. The company moved forward. Companies always move forward. That was the thing about institutions. They had a momentum that individual failures couldn't permanently stop. The board was chastened. Natalie was sharper than she'd been before October, in the specific way that people become sharper after they've made a significant mistake and taken it seriously. The Langford situation would play out in federal court over the following year, and the story would be told and retold in press coverage and industry circles and eventually become a case study in some business school course on corporate governance failures, stripped of most of its human detail, reduced to the data points that made it instructive. That was fine. Case studies were for institutions. The human part was for the people who'd been in it. The evening that Mason thought of later as the real ending, not the board meeting, not the signing, not any of the formal moments, but the actual ending, happened on a Friday night in late November, when the first snow of the season came to the city. It wasn't a storm, just a quiet, steady snowfall that started around 4 in the afternoon and covered everything by 6. The kind of snow that made the city look briefly like a different, simpler version of itself before the morning traffic turned it gray. Natalie had stopped by. She'd been doing this, stopping by, without it being a formal arrangement or a scheduled thing, just an occasional presence that had gradually become less surprising and more routine. She'd brought dinner again, but she seemed to have decided that bringing food was her contribution to the arrangement, possibly because it was one of the few domestic acts available to her in someone else's home, and she was a person who needed to contribute something tangible, or she didn't know what to do with herself. Chloe had discovered 2 weeks earlier that Natalie was not great at card games, and had exploited this discovery without mercy. They were playing cards at the kitchen table when Mason looked up from the dishes and saw the snow coming down past the window. Thick and steady, the streetlight below catching each flake individually before it disappeared into the accumulated white on the parked cars and the sidewalk and the fire escape railing. "It's snowing," he said. Chloe dropped her cards and ran to the window. "Can we go outside?" "It's 8:30. "It's the first snow." He looked at it, at the city going white and quiet outside the glass. 5 minutes, he said. "Coats? Boots? The real ones." Chloe was already halfway to the hall closet. Natalie looked at him from the table. She had 3 cards in her hand and an expression that suggested she'd been losing but had not fully accepted it. "You too," he said. She blinked. You have a coat," he said. "You were wearing it when you came in." She looked at the window, at the snow, at Chloe, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway in her coat and boots and a hat with a pom-pom that sat slightly crooked on her head, and who was looking at Natalie with the specific expectation of someone who did not see an obstacle here. "Okay," Natalie said. They went downstairs and out into it. The street was quiet, the way streets were quiet in new snow. A softness in the air, the sound of the city muffled and distant, the world temporarily smaller and more manageable. Chloe immediately identified and stomped through the largest undisturbed patch of snow on the sidewalk, then reported on the sound. Natalie stood with her hands in her coat pockets, her breath visible, looking up at the flakes coming down through the streetlight. Mason stood between them and looked at the street. It was cold. The snow was coming down steadily. His left shoe, the one he'd fixed twice with superglue, the one he'd never gotten around to replacing, was already letting in cold through the sole, because of course it was. He looked up at the falling snow. He thought about Laura. He almost always did in first snows, because the first snow had been her favorite, not for any complicated reason, but because she said it was the one day a year the city looked like it was trying. He thought about the wooden box on the shelf in his office, which now had a copy of the formal historical record document tucked inside it, not replacing anything, just adding to it, one more layer in the archive of a thing that had been worth building. He thought about Chloe, who was now attempting to catch snowflakes on her tongue with the focused intensity she brought to every project. He thought about Natalie standing a few feet away, looking up at the sky with an expression that was, for once, completely unguarded. He didn't think about the 14th floor or the conference room or the 40 people. That was not a thing he needed to keep carrying. It had happened, and it had been handled, and the shape of his life had come through. It changed but not broken, and that was enough. There was a thing he'd learned in the 4 years since he'd become a father alone, since he'd had to be both present and sufficient in the way that two people had been before. You couldn't spend your energy on the things that had already happened, and also be present for what was happening now. You had to choose, and choosing was not forgetting, it was just choosing. Chloe caught a snowflake. She announced this with the gravity of a significant achievement. "Did it taste like anything?" Natalie asked. Chloe considered. "Cold," she said, "and a little bit like outside." "That tracks," Natalie said. Mason looked at her. She glanced over and caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. Not defensively, just the human reflex of noticing attention. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked back up at the snow. "You're doing that thing where you look at people like you're trying to figure something out." "I do that?" "Yes." "And did you figure it out?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I think you're wondering if this is going to be okay," she said. He was quiet. "Not the company stuff," she said. "Just this. All of it." He looked at Chloe, who had moved on from snowflake catching to attempting to build something with a thin layer of snow on the car hood, which was not yet sufficient for construction, but which she was working with anyway. "I think it's going to be something," he said. "I don't know if okay is the right word." "What's the right word?" He thought about it, about the months ahead, the federal case, the consulting work, the gradual normalization of a life that had been turned over and set back down at an angle, about Chloe growing up the way she was going to grow up, curious and direct and occasionally inconvenient and entirely herself, about the wooden box and its contents and the work that it had finally, after 7 years, been allowed to do, about a woman who had kept a careful record of everything because she believed that the truth, if you documented it well enough, would eventually find its way to where it was needed, about a CEO who had gotten it wrong and had the decency to keep going until she got it right. "Real," he said finally. "That's probably the right word." Natalie looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back up at the snow. "Yeah," she said. "That works." The snow came down. Chloe declared that she was naming the car hood snowbank Gerald Jr. after the rabbit, and that it was now under her protection. The city moved around them, quiet and white, and indifferent in the way cities were, doing what it always did, holding people inside it without caring, which was fine, which was actually fine, because the caring was something you carried yourself in the specific people you stood next to in the snow. There was no ceremony to it, no resolution that arrived clean and intact. The legal case would drag through the year. Mason's shoe was going to need replacing. Natalie was still going to be the person who'd stood up in a conference room and said his name like a verdict in front of 40 witnesses. And that would sit between them sometimes, uncomfortable and real, the way significant things did. The wooden box would stay on the shelf. Laura's name would be in the company's record now where it belonged, which was the most that could be done and was not the same as enough. But Chloe was catching snowflakes. The streetlight was making the falling snow into something briefly beautiful. A man who had been quietly building things his whole life, first a company, then a family, then a life that fit around the thing that mattered most, was standing on a sidewalk in the first snow of winter, cold through his left shoe, with his daughter and a person who had wronged him and had come back anyway. And the air tasted like cold and a little bit like outside. And that was, in the most honest sense of the word, enough. It had always been enough. The world didn't reward the people who built things quietly. It mostly didn't notice them until something broke and someone thought to look. That was a truth worth knowing. Not with bitterness, but clearly the way Laura had known it. The way she documented everything in her small tilted handwriting just in case. You built what you built because it was worth building. You kept the record because the truth deserved a witness. You showed up for the people who needed you there, and you let that be the measure. Because the other measures, the titles, the recognition, the corner offices, and the public credit, those were real, but they were not the realest thing. The realest thing was small and ordinary and right in front of you. A girl in a crooked pom-pom hat, naming a snowbank. The first snow of winter, coming down. A life still going.